start with, I'm not going to answer Uskali's question as a list of questions, but rather reflect around the themes. Some of what I'm going to present here will be somewhat overlapping with what has already been said in the introduction, but I hope you don't mind too much. Most of what was said, I of course agreed with, only that I find that in order to provoke discussion, Uskali wanted to make a very sharp distinction between the ideals of social science and think tanks, and somehow to me it seems that the practice of doing social science and working for a think tank is not that different on a day-to-day basis. I shifted from being a social scientist, a lecturer in social and public policy, to being a think tank director, and it's only just appeared to me that this is the first time I've really had to think through what it means to work for a think tank from a social scientific point of view, and the first time I've had to defend myself as a director of a think tank and therefore a potential propagandist. And it was actually somehow surprising to find myself thinking through that I've never really had to seriously face these questions, mostly because personally I felt the transition from academia to think tank was such a smooth process. I find myself doing a lot of very similar things that what I used to do when working at the university. Nevertheless, a few reflections, and I try to focus on the difference between think tanks and academia, and what I guess you're sort of provoking as the main question, which is the criteria of demarcation between social science and think tank work. To start with, of course, we note that there's a very visible emergence of think tanks. Of course, the phenomenon itself, or the institution itself, are old, as was already mentioned in the introduction, but clearly there are lots more think tanks than there used to be in numerical terms, and they tend to be also more influential as they used to be. This applies both globally and especially within Finland. Here, I guess, political think tanks are something of a relatively new phenomenon. So we somehow have to look at the soil in which think tanks emerge. What is the sort of social condition which gives rise to these kinds of institutions, give some kind of social demand for them. First, it seems to me that there's an ever less clear demarcation between academia, independent research units, NGOs, lobby organizations, and so on. So if we want to defend academic ideals, academic values of social science, we have to know that there's a constant push also within academia to be more policy relevant and to engage in dialogues with civil society, engage in dialogues with politicians, publish more and communicate more in also popular arenas, always have a blog, and so on, so on, so on. So clearly, what I find is also a process in which academia moves in its ideas and practices towards the practices of NGOs or think tanks, and not only a process in which think tanks emerge. Also, a lot of NGOs, lobby organizations, have something of a research arm, do some kind of knowledge production, independent surveys, knowledge production, and so on and so on. And this further makes the demarcation between academia and other social organizations more. It makes the demarcation ever less clear. And somehow we note the change in politics itself. Perhaps some decades ago, the sort of big ideologies which were guiding political practices were a lot more clear to anyone involved in politics or any citizens in general. It was quite clear that there's a difference between left-wing, right-wing ideologies. Lots of social utopias which were inspiring people might have been a bit off the ground, but at least they were clear and inspiring and presenting a clear alternative to the existing order. And the kind of politics which seems to have emerged during the past 2-3 decades can be classified more as mere governance than politics reacting to some overarching large social utopia or a big ideology. And therefore there seems to be also a general pressure to produce a kind of utopian thinking or more scientific ideas to motivate politics and show that there's a difference between different political ideas and so on. And this is part of the soil on which think tanks emerge as a phenomenon. In Finland, the very practical reason between the emergence of think tanks like the one I work for was a policy program designed by a past government which aimed at involving citizens more in politics. Now it's very unclear to me why the policy program for political involvement of citizens led to funding for think tanks. This is totally unclear to me, but somehow this was the excuse for setting up such institutions in Finland as a very practical political reason behind it. Now of course there are also independent private-funded think tanks. That's a bit of a different story. But also they seem to have emerged in the wake of these sort of official political think tanks. Further, I'm not that convinced that there's such a thing as a think tank identity. That we can take think tanks as a sort of uniform group with a clearly exclusive identity and start analyzing what think tanks are, what they do, and so on. Clearly some institutions which call themselves think tanks are closer to academic research. They can be very, very close to academic research in their everyday practices. Some are clearly closer to NGOs, even charities, producing information for the need of individual political campaigns and so on. And some, inevitably, are very close to lobbies, right? Producing information for the benefits of some industry or some group and so on. And if you look at what kind of institutions globally are called think tanks, quite a lot of them, and most of the most influential ones, are such that think tank can be seen as a euphemism for a lobby organization. You have to bear this in mind also. So, what we can ask is that is there a need to find a think tank identity, or rather to acknowledge the pluralism of producers of social scientific knowledge and all the related problems of reliability. I would argue that the group of institutions called think tanks is such heterogeneous that you don't necessarily have to think of a scientific or social scientific problem of the reliability of information produced by think tanks, but rather should be looking at an ever more heterogeneous field of producers of social scientific knowledge, bear in mind that also academic social science can have very different starting points and ideas and relations to high scientific standards. Now, a few points on the demarcation between think tanks and social science nevertheless. Now, I tried to say something about this demarcation, but I hope you bear in mind that this would be my main approach, which I have just presented. That's this kind of uniform think tank identity doesn't seem to my mind, in my mind, to exist. Now, first, of course, a lot of think tanks can exist only for propaganda reasons, and we have to bear this in mind. For example, the clearest example of such, to me, would seem to be the very large financial means enjoyed by, for example, different climate change denialist groups. They inevitably get a lot, considerable funds from, for example, oil industries and so on, and all of them call themselves, of course, think tanks. Now, also, there seems to be, having said this, there seems to be a genuine difficulty to demarcate between such propaganda and social scientific schools of thought. For example, if you look at Marxism and liberalism as social scientific disciplines, it would be difficult to say that one is about propaganda and one is about social scientific research, but very clearly they are associated with different ends of the political spectrum. Yet both schools of thought are very consistent in their own terms, very logistically consistent. It's not that they have necessarily different presets or prefixed conclusions, but rather different entry points to the study of social reality. And any research from these entry points can, as said, be carried out very coherently and consistently. Also, clearly, think tanks don't usually have any criterion for pre-review for assessing methodological choices. And this is usually what would be most likely the most typical difference between think tank practice and social scientific research. We hope, in social science, we expect any piece of research to pass some kind of test of anonymous peer review. Rather, what think tanks do have is something of an open choice whether or not to use such. A lot of think tanks actually have processes recently, open peer review, or double-blind review, or something like that. But the identity of think tanks leaves open the choice whether or not to commit oneself to to following such scientific processes. And very often there seems to be attempts to create something resembling peer review. For example, a lot of think tanks have scientific committees. Individual research projects can have something as a scientific leading group, a steering group. Think tanks seem to develop, most typically, most often, scientific criteria which are not yet identical to those followed in social science. Still, you have to keep in mind that the choice between social scientific schools of thought is also always political to some extent. Because there is no value-free social science and little reason to draw a sharp distinction between facts and value in social science, we cannot use the notion of facts as a demarcation criteria between social science and something else think tanks represent, but rather we have to somehow appeal to scientific processes or scientific process criteria, such as peer review or something resembling that, or more sort of generally appeal to something which we call scientific values. Now, my suggestion is the best I can come up with. What could be the sort of conceptual tool for analyzing when social scientific knowledge produced by a think tank is reliable and when it's not, would be to use some kind of concept of scientific values or scientific integrity. And of course, this cannot be assessed from the outside. It's all a think tank can do is to try to follow such scientific values or integrity in its research or an openness to counter-arguments, and slowly hope to convince its audience that it's really committed to following such values, and it's really committed to such kind of integrity in its approach to research. And further, of course, scientific research doesn't resolve political disputes. This was one of the questions I was asked to reflect here. But it can show what kind of claims are wrong, or clearly wrong, or suspect. And therefore think tanks can do pretty much the same, but pick their topics of analysis perhaps more flexibly than social science. Somehow they can work towards the same goal as social science in the respect of showing what is clearly false or what kind of claims don't seem to have any empirical grounding. I'm just about to finish. Now, of course, the topic of this session is the difference between social science and think tanks. But to me, it seems that a lot of sort of practical day-to-day reflection I need to do in my work is not actually reflecting the difference between knowledge production within a think tank and social science, but the difference between knowledge production within think tank and actual day-to-day politics or class politics. And what think tanks do differently from politics is to somehow try to produce a longer term or somehow deeper or more sophisticated vision of social science, of society, future of society, try to engage social scientific concepts in politics, and try to push some kind of systematic analysis to the field of politics. Because politics often has problems communicating any sort of long-term vision beyond day-to-day political governance. And my last slide, practically, what we do in the think tank. I think is clarifying if you try to reflect think tanks in comparison to the everyday practice of social science. First, creating some kind of social visions. Try to do conceptual innovation. Try to look at existing social phenomena and try to push one's own concepts to describing such phenomena, and try to also formulate some kind of utopian futures from one's own value perspective. None of this has to relate directly to everyday politics. Second, do analysis based on somewhat lighter or somewhat less restrictive methodology than typical social science. For example, we've published a number of reports based on expert interviews. Now, you couldn't do that in systematic social science, I guess, or it would be a bit suspect, sort of borderline social scientific methodology. For a think tank, it's very kind of a natural thing to do. Pick, say, 10 or 15 prominent experts of a field and do something of a half-structured interview of those experts, and then try to gather or somehow put together something of a synthesis of what they have to say. Now, of course, that's very value-laden for the very reason that you pick the experts, right? There's no systematic criteria for picking such experts you could really defend. But nevertheless, that's producing somewhat interesting and relevant information. Third, can pick underexplored topics with some social relevance and engage with them quite quickly. Now, as an example, I'm starting myself to carry out after Christmas a small report on the social relevance of time banking. Now, I'm sure there'll be a lot of PhDs on time banks and community exchange in Finland and so on, but that will take time, right? It'll take time to sort of initiate that kind of research. It'll take time to apply funds for that kind of research, and it will take a few years to actually conduct that properly. Think tanks can react to that kind of underexplored topics, do something within a time frame of 2-3 months, which doesn't necessarily pass all social scientific criteria, but it's there quite quickly when the topic seems to be generally relevant in political discussion. And I could add number 4, which is providing a platform for like-minded researchers. Now, practically, a lot of think tanks seem to be, for example, publishing journals. Maybe peer-reviewed, maybe not, but anyway, something of a social scientific journal. And the work of think tank doesn't necessarily need to be anything else than merely providing such a platform for people academic social scientific researchers to publishing. Now, of course, there would be a very natural selection of who's interested in publishing in a given think tank's journal, but nevertheless, a lot of work done within think tanks can be just about providing such a platform which of course doesn't raise similar kinds of demarcation problems as knowledge production itself does. Now, I seem to have used more than my time, so I stop now. Thank you.